Good morning. It's a great day, and we are nearing the end of the book of James, but we're not there yet. As a matter of fact, even though there are only a few verses left, they're so packed full that I'm only going to do one verse for our lesson today. That won't be true of the rest of the book, but it is true of this one, and you're going to see why. I'm opening the time with a question that I'm asking the meaning of an old saying that probably everybody's heard, and it's, that man is as good as his word. Or you might hear someone say, his word is his bond. And I'm sure that you understand that James is going to be talking to us today about integrity, I guess, of our words, honesty, being faithful to what we say that we are going to do. I can remember raising children, and questions would come up like, so can we go and do such and such? And I might answer with, we'll see. Well, we'll see just means I don't want to make a promise for something that I may not be able to fulfill. Although I'm sure my kids sometimes would think that we'll see actually means no, we won't. But the idea there is in our verse today is about making promises and swearing in our promises or making oaths in our promises. All right, so let's read it. It is James chapter 5, verse 12. But above all, my brothers, do not swear, either by heaven or by earth or by any other oath, but let your yes be yes and your no be no, so that you may not fall under condemnation. So, one short verse, but so much in it. Now, I want to point out one of the reasons that I am doing only one verse is because James tells us right off the bat, but above all, in other words, is he saying, okay, this might be the most important thing I've said in the entire book? Well, I don't think so. I think that this is in the context of just some specifics that he has mentioned so far. I think he wants us to look back at what he's been addressing, and kind of a general flow that we've pulled out of this is that James is concerned about Christians having worldly thinking. We've looked at there's worldly wisdom and there's human wisdom. There's worldly wisdom and there's heavenly wisdom or God's wisdom. He's told us that worldly thinking can show up in the life of a believer in how we treat others. Or do we slander them or judge them, or do we accept them? Worldly thinking can show up in how we are prideful instead of humble, in impatience, being impatient during tough times rather than having a patient, eternal perspective. Worldly thinking comes up when it comes to making plans for the future. And so James, when he says, do not swear, he isn't on our case about using swear words like we might imagine at first glance. He's not coming at us with a bar of soap. But it does have a lot to do with our mouths. James says a whole lot about our words. Remember the chapter about the rudder of a ship and the bit in the mouth of a horse? That conversation had more applications than we could ever cover, and it would probably include the topic of words that need to be washed out with soap. But that isn't his point today. James is addressing the custom of swearing oaths, which was a major part of life in the Old Testament times. And so it had also become an issue in the early church, particularly the predominantly Jewish congregations to which James was writing. So since swearing oaths was really an integral part of Jewish tradition, the Jewish believers brought that practice into the church. But such oath-taking is unnecessary among Christians because our speech should be honest. Our lives should be demonstrating integrity, credibility, and truthfulness. So for believers, a simple yes or no should suffice because they're faithful to keep their word. As a Christian, we see there's so many passages in the New Testament about truthfulness. Colossians 3:9 says, "Do not lie to one another, seeing that you have put off the old self with its practices." Ephesians 4:25 says, "So stop telling lies. Let us tell our neighbors the truth, for we are all parts of the same body." So you see that the context is the same in both of those, that he's speaking to us as Christians, and he's saying now that we are Christians, we stop lying to one another. Okay? That should not be a practice of us as believers, because we have now been regenerated with a new way of thinking, and he's telling us to put on these new habits. So what are some scenarios where we might have difficulty speaking the truth? I think there's tons of examples. I just jotted down 2 or 3. We're afraid to hurt someone's feelings, so we don't tell them what we really think. We don't want to admit that we were wrong about something, and it's kind of a sticky situation, and so we defend ourselves by telling a lie. How about getting these invitations that you've got to RSVP, and it may be 2 months to the future, and I personally, this is just my personality, but I tend to always want to go to everything. I tend to want to accept every invitation. And so the problem or the challenge that comes for us is that, well, in the moment, it sounded like a great idea, but when the time actually comes, it's like, ooh, I really don't want to go. And so do we make up a lie to get out of a commitment that we've made? That is one temptation that we all have dealt with and maybe do quite frequently. Am I going to tell the truth and say, it's just not a good idea for me this time? I mean, it's really a tough thing to do because we think we've got to have some kind of explanation that is weighty or important or something. I'm not sure what the motivation is. So let's do a little background on oaths and vows, because we're going to see both James and Jesus making similar statements about swearing or by making an oath. What is that all about? It was a common and acceptable practice in the Old Testament and among the Jews. And I want to look at one verse in the New Testament before we go to the Old Testament, where we see more about it. But in Hebrews 6:13, it says, "For when God made a promise to Abraham, since he had no one greater by whom to swear, he swore by himself." Okay, so this is God saying, the writer of Hebrews saying something about the weightiness of a promise or an oath was demonstrated. It was elevating an oath by swearing by God. God swore by himself because God stands alone at the top of all of history in the whole universe. He's the first and the last word. He cannot lie. No one is over him, and everyone under him will have to bow before him. Can you imagine existing for all of eternity and never coming up against anyone who can beat you up? Well, that's God. So there's no reason for the writer of Hebrews to say, there's a big reason for the writer of Hebrews to say there's no one greater by whom you could swear. But Deuteronomy gives us more information about this thing of swearing by God. Deuteronomy 10, verses 17 to 21. "For the Lord your God is the God of gods and the Lord of lords, the great, the mighty, and the awesome God who does not show partiality or take a bribe. He executes justice for the orphan and the widow, and shows his love for the alien by giving him food and clothing. So show your love for the alien, for you were aliens in the land of Egypt. You shall fear the Lord your God. You shall serve him and cling to him, and you shall swear by his name. He is your praise. He is your God, who has done great things, awesome things for you, which your eyes have seen. So, what we see in these verses is that God is worthy of our praise. What are the reasons? Well, he's the God of gods and Lord of lords. He's great. He's mighty. He's awesome. He doesn't show partiality. He's fair. He's just to the orphan and the widow. He's fair and caring for the foreigner who lives in your region. So this is a very accurate description of the worthiness of God for us to make an oath in his name. Verse 20 clearly says it. You shall swear by his name. And this means that the common denominator between an oath and a vow or swearing was God as the object. Okay? It was elevating God. Let me read you this quote. Generally speaking, an oath was swearing by God, and a vow was swearing to God. Once they had named God as their witness, they had lifted the matter to a very serious and sober level. Okay, do you hear what it's saying? This is a quote from Beth Moore. And I think that people somehow innately know this, that if we are making a promise about something to someone, often human beings will say, I swear to God. I swear on my mother's grave. I swear, whatever they consider worthy of making this kind of commitment, they might add that to it, to the promise, which would elevate it in our minds, in the recipient's mind, to, okay, well, they must be speaking the truth. They must be believable in what they're saying. Deuteronomy 23 goes a little further, 21 to 23. When you make a vow to your God, you shall not delay to pay for it, for it would be sin to you, and the Lord your God will surely require it of you. However, if you refrain from vowing, it would not be a sin to you. You shall be careful to perform what goes out from your lips, just as you have voluntarily vowed to the Lord your God what you have promised. So the instructions that God gives us concerning vows is be sure that you keep it. Because if you don't keep it, it would be sin. But he's also not saying that you have to swear by God. It doesn't mean that you have to make a promise, which is what I was saying earlier in the opening. Often as parents, we are very hesitant to make promises to our children because we know from experience and maturity in life, we know that very often we're not going to be able to keep those promises. And so for us to make promises can be sinful if we're not able to keep those promises. Can you think of an example in the Old Testament of a man who made a vow to God and later regretted it? Well, if you're real familiar with the book of Judges, which a lot of people aren't, in Judges 11 we read of a man named Jephthah, and Jephthah made a promise to God, a vow to God, in the heat of battle, that if you will give us this victory, I will sacrifice whatever comes out my front door. Not realizing, because we can't know the future, not realizing that the first thing out of his front door was his daughter. And so as a very religious, faithful Old Testament Jew, he fulfilled his vow. That's a scary thought, isn't it? And then there's one more Old Testament passage I want to take you to in Ecclesiastes 5, verses 4 through 6. When you make a vow to God, do not be late in paying it, for he takes no delight in fools. Pay what you vow. It's better that you should not vow than you should vow and not pay. Do not let your speech cause you to sin, and do not say in the presence of the messenger of God that it was a mistake. Why should God be angry on account of your voice and destroy the work of your hands? Wow. It's a very strong warning to us that we must be full of integrity and honesty and truthfulness in our conversations. That what we say, people are going to hold us account, but more specifically, God is going to hold us to account. Paul says that very clearly in the New Testament, that there will come a time when we will have to account for every careless word that we say. So we have to be careful. Now, with all those scriptures saying that it's fine to make an oath or a vow if you plan to keep it, what exactly has motivated James to be so adamantly against it? Well, I'm thinking most likely it's his big brother Jesus, which we'll see in just a minute. But I want you to remember that he has already told us in chapter 4, verse 14, about making boasts about our big plans. He says, "Why, you don't even know a thing about tomorrow and what it will bring. So watch your mouth saying, I'm going to go do this or that." Our words and promises matter. So can you think of an occasion, and this has happened to me, when someone asks you to swear not to tell anyone what you're about to share with them or what they're about to share with you? What if the information involved a very dangerous situation or something illegal, or that the person was considering taking their life? And after hearing it, you realize they had put you in an impossible situation, just as Jephthah was put in an impossible situation. So that alone gives us pause and reason enough to stop and think, wait a minute, they're wanting to share something with me, and they're not willing to give me any wiggle room in whether or not, after hearing it, that I have to still keep the promise. That really is a difficult situation. It happened to me and years ago, and a friendship was lost on account of it. It was thankfully there was before this person passed, there was an opportunity to have some closure on that, but it was an impossible scenario. And so be careful asking others to make promises that they may not be able to keep. It's not fair to that person. All right, so maybe James had that kind of scenario in his mind when he wrote this passage that we have in James 5, verse 12. Let your yes be yes and your no be no. But I think it could probably stem back to Jesus' words in Matthew 5. Now remember, this is the Sermon on the Mount, probably the most important sermon that's ever been preached, and very, very famous. He says, "But I say to you, make no oath at all, either by heaven, for it is the throne of God, or by the earth, for that it is the footstool of his feet, or by Jerusalem, for it is the city of the great king. Nor shall you make an oath by your head, for you cannot make one hair white or black, but let your statement be yes or no. Anything beyond these is of the evil one." one more thing before we look at it deeply, but I want to just make one more comment about the Sermon on the Mount. Here is Jesus taking up 3+ chapters in this sermon that really put a lot of Old Testament teaching in the law in a new light. His goal was never, and he states it clearly, his goal was not to do away with Old Testament teaching. His goal was to take the Old Testament teaching and give it a meaning and a perspective from his appearance on the earth, from his work and our salvation, that he said we could just reduce it all of that sermon, all of the Old Testament, down to love God with all your heart, soul, mind, and strength, and love others as yourself. So that instead of having to keep up with the minutiae of the law, if what we're doing demonstrates that we love God with all of our heart, all of our soul, all of our might, and that we love our neighbor as ourselves, then we're good. We're good with God. Sometimes take the 10 Commandments, for example, and ask yourself with each commandment, does this commandment have to do with loving God or with loving others? And if in my answer I say this has to do with God, then I need to obey that commandment, because to not obey it would show that I don't love God. And the same with the rest of the commandments. Does this commandment that has to do with my neighbor, does it show that I am not loving my neighbor well? Well, if it would show that, then I don't need to do it. I need to obey the commandment. And so that's kind of the perspective we need to have when we go through the Sermon on the Mount. And this, as I said, this passage is right there in the heart of it. So looking at what he said and what James said in chapter 5, verse 12, I want you to see the similarities. Both James and Matthew says, don't swear either by heaven or earth or any other oath. Jesus said, don't make any oath at all, either by heaven, for it is the throne of God, or by earth, for it's the footstool of God, or by Jerusalem, for it's the city of the great King. Don't make an oath by your head, and let your yes be yes and your no be no. Same thing James said, let your yes be yes and your no be no. Jesus just gave it more illustration, okay? He, in addition to don't swear by God, he's also saying don't make an oath or swear by the throne of God, by the earth, it's the footstool, by Jerusalem, it's the city of the great King. Don't even make it by your own head. Don't put your hand on your head, which maybe that was an Old Testament thing. By swear by my own self, because you don't have any control even on your own self. So both of them agree that it's your yes should be yes, your no should be no. But there's one other thing that's similar about these two passages of James and Jesus. Both end with a kind of a because. Jesus says, because anything beyond this is of the evil one. Who is that? The devil. James said, if you do make a promise and break it, then you're going to fall under condemnation or judgment. Now, isn't that interesting? Falling under condemnation or judgment, and the idea of this being of the evil one. These are related statements. Satan would love nothing better than to help lead me to a place of being under God's judgment. And in John 8:44, Jesus says about Satan and his ugly MO, there is no truth in him. When he tells a lie, he speaks from his own nature, because he is a liar and the father of lies. So both Jesus and James understand that Satan loves it when we break a promise, that we're no different from the worldly mindset James has talked about when we break a promise. We are in agreement that truth is relative. Well, it's true in this situation, but it's not true in that situation. You know, a previous U.S. president back in the late 90s taught us this more than 20 years ago when he tried to get out of a sticky situation by saying, well, it depends on what is. Do you remember that? Oaths are basically saying, you can trust me on this promise because I'm qualifying it with an oath. But without the oath, all bets are off. James B. Adamson in the NIV commentary said, swearing is necessary only in a society where truth is not reverenced. Basically, what that means is if someone swears something to you with an oath, I swear to God, then you should be looking for a big red flag. There is no truth in what that person is saying. A woman in one of the Bible studies yesterday spent her career studying criminal behavior. Can you imagine that? And a lot of her work involved witnessing, talking to a criminal. And this criminal, she said there is no exception. Time after time after time, when a criminal said, I swear I didn't do it, every single time they were proven guilty. She said it just was shocking to me that was always the case. Swearing to God that they were innocent was just an evidence that they had done what they were accused of. John MacArthur says that fallen men are basically genetic liars. In other words, non-Christians. And really, truly, we have to say all of us were born into the universe with a fallen nature. And so we are by birth and by relationship to Adam and Eve, we are genetically wired to be untruthful. However, getting back to what John MacArthur says, that means we live in a world of lies and should surprise no one familiar with the Scriptures. The Scriptures designate unregenerate humanity as children of the devil, the father of lies. That basic dishonesty has led men to impose oaths on others in an often futile attempt to force them to be truthful and keep their promises. From the simple oaths of children, cross my heart, hope to die, stick a needle in my eye. But then when they break their promise, that they claim that they had their fingers crossed. There's all kinds of other oaths and vows that are required by organizations. And there's anything from legal contracts to peace treaties, but they're necessitated by the reality, the recognition of mankind's basic dishonesty. It is hardwired into us to defend ourselves, to say whatever we have to say to save our rear end. Okay, and so that is mankind's basic nature. But as Christians, James is trying to say to us, don't go there. Yes, you still have a sin nature, but you are called to honesty. You might be wondering by now if God disapproves of us taking any kind of oath at all, to tell the truth, nothing but the truth, so help me God, in a courtroom or other official setting. I don't think that's what Jesus or James is referring to. Now, as I've studied this, there are only a few commentaries that will go that far, but the majority felt that it was a bit too literal to do so. But it definitely says a lot about our worldly culture that we have to fear contempt of court charges in order to keep us honest on the witness stand. So that's a very, very good possibility that you or I would end up in a witness chair at a trial at some point in our lives. And I don't think that the Bible is to be taken as literally as some do, saying that we should never be willing to make that kind of oath. But that's neither here nor there. It's not a right or wrong, in my opinion. It's for us to, every individual, to decide that on their own. But the other thing I would say related to this is that when we're joined together in holy matrimony in a biblical wedding ceremony, we're going to make vows to one another. The vows are biblical, even if they don't mean a hill of beans in our culture today. 50 years ago, this April the 22nd, John and I vowed several things to each other. And these vows mean more to us today than they did back then. I mean, they really, truly kind of went over my head, actually, in the moment. But I am so grateful that God gave us role models through the years, godly role models, who showed us that we can keep our vows until death parts us. You know, for the Christian, life cannot be divided into compartments in some of which that God is involved, and in others He's not. There can't be one kind of language for the Christian and another kind of language for the non-Christian. For instance, a language that you would use at church, but when you're not at church and you're at work or in the neighborhood, you use a different kind of language. There can't be one standard of conduct in the church and another standard of conduct in the business world. The fact is, God does not need to be invited into certain parts of our lives, but kept out of others. He's everywhere, all through life and every activity of life. He hears not only the words which are spoken in His name, He hears all words. And so there can't be any such thing as a form of words which evades bringing God into a transaction or into a conversation. We should regard all promises as sacred if we remember that all promises are made in the presence of God. Just want to close with this quote to you from Haddon Robinson in the book, The Christian Salt and Light Company. He says in that book, with regard to the Sermon on the Mount, if anger was the real issue in murder, and lust was the real issue in adultery, and selfishness was the real issue in divorce, then deceit is the real issue in oaths. He says Jesus wasn't addressing whether or not we should take an oath. He was talking about whether or not we are truthful. We don't tell the truth because we've taken an oath. We tell the truth because we're truthful. And that is my desire. I've confessed this before the groups yesterday, and I'll just tell you guys again. Being honest is difficult for me as a person who is incredibly social. And I'm around people so much, and I'm kind of a pleaser. And I want to make people happy. And so I am often, quite often, faced with the challenge of, well, should I say what is really true in this situation? It might hurt her feelings. Or it might make me look bad in front of this person if I tell them what I really think. And so it's very, very challenging to all of us, because I think all of us fall into this same situation time after time after time. Am I willing, as Scripture says, to tell the truth in love? That's an important thing, isn't it, ladies? We should tell the truth, but we need to do it lovingly and with compassion and with integrity. So, ladies, thank you for listening, and I will see you again next week.